When my wife and I first moved into this neighborhood 15 years ago, we thought we'd found our forever home. We were tucked into a quiet cul-de-sac with tall oaks lining the back of the properties, and right behind our fence ran a narrow creek. It wasn't just any random ditch. It was an old, natural drainage channel, carved out decades ago by the constant flow of rainwater from the hills above us. The water would snake along a bed of smooth stones, past wild grasses and blackberry bushes, before disappearing into a wider stream that eventually fed into the river. In the dry season, it was little more than a trickle, the kind of peaceful background sound you hardly noticed after a while. But when the storms came in late spring, you could hear it roar. The water would rush through, carrying leaves and twigs, and within hours the excess rain was whisked away from our street, preventing any flooding. I liked knowing it was there. It felt like one of those hidden, overlooked features that made the property special, a piece of nature that quietly worked to protect the neighborhood. The HOA never really touched it. It was part of what the county called a natural easement, meaning it wasn't owned by me or any single homeowner, but was protected as a waterway, with strict rules that no one could build over or obstruct it. That all changed 2 years ago. A new HOA board was elected, younger, flashier, and very into modernizing the community. Their monthly newsletters were full of bold ideas, updated lighting fixtures, new landscaping, and even a revitalization plan for unused common areas. At first, it sounded exciting, like maybe they'd finally fix the cracked tennis court or repaint the clubhouse. But then, one Saturday morning, 3 members of the board showed up at my back gate with rolled-up blueprints under their arms. The HOA president, a guy named Derek who always wore sunglasses even indoors, started explaining how they wanted to maximize the aesthetic appeal of the creek area. The plan? Cover the creek with a reinforced concrete culvert, fill it in with soil, and build a paved walking trail right over it. He painted a picture of kids riding bikes, joggers enjoying the shade, and families taking sunset strolls. It's wasted space right now, Derek said, smiling like he'd just offered me a winning lottery ticket. I told him immediately that it wasn't wasted space, it was a drainage channel. I explained how the creek handled massive amounts of runoff during storms, and how blocking it could back up water into our yards. He waved me off with a chuckle. "We'll be using professionals," he said. "We've done our research. Trust me, the HOA would never approve something unsafe." Except, they hadn't done any research. When I asked if they'd checked with the county, Derek's smile faltered for a second. "We're in talks," he said, but the way he avoided eye contact told me everything I needed to know. I tried reasoning with them. I pointed to the large, permanent metal sign posted by the county years ago. Protected drainage easement, do not obstruct. I even pulled out my phone and showed them pictures from a storm 2 years earlier, when the creek was a rushing torrent. They acted like I was being overly dramatic. "Come on," one of them said, "it's not a river. It's just a little stream. We're improving the neighborhood here." They left with their blueprints, clearly convinced they were visionaries, while I stood there staring at the creek, my creek, with a knot in my stomach. I had a bad feeling that nature wasn't going to take kindly to being paved over. 3 weeks later, my bad feeling turned into cold reality. It started on a Tuesday morning. I woke up to the steady, rhythmic beeping of heavy machinery backing up somewhere behind my house. At first, I thought maybe the county had finally sent someone to clean the creek, maybe remove debris before the rainy season. But when I stepped onto my back porch, coffee in hand, I nearly dropped the mug. 2 bright yellow excavators were parked just a few feet from the creek bank. A crew of men in neon vests and hard hats were already unloading massive concrete slabs from a flatbed truck. The sound of diesel engines and the metallic clang of chains filled the air. I walked straight to the back fence and waved to one of the workers. "Morning," I called. "What's going on here?" The guy didn't even look up, just pointed toward a man in a crisp polo shirt with a clipboard. It was Derek, the HOA president, grinning like a kid on Christmas. "Great news," Derek shouted over the noise. "We're starting the creek project early. Should be done in 2 weeks." I walked around to the front, through the access gate the HOA had unlocked for the crew, and cornered him near a stack of steel rebar. "Derek, I told you before, you can't do this. It's a protected drainage easement. You need county approval. He gave me the same patient but condescending look people use on toddlers. Relax, he said. We got a quote from a reputable contractor. They've done work in subdivisions all over the state. That's not the same as getting permission, I snapped. You're blocking a natural waterway. When the rains come, the water will have nowhere to go. Derek smirked. That's the point. The culvert will redirect it underground. You'll hardly notice it's there. And by the way, your property value is going to go up. You should be thanking us. I felt my jaw tighten. You're going to regret this, I told him. He didn't respond, just turned back to the crew and started giving directions. Over the next week, I watched in disbelief as they tore into the creek. The excavators scooped out sections of the bank, flattening the slopes into harsh, vertical cuts. They lowered the concrete culvert sections into place like coffin lids, sealing away the trickle of water that had once run freely. They filled the gaps with gravel, then poured in soil to cover the top. The air smelled of wet earth and diesel fumes. The hum of machinery went on from sunrise to sunset. Neighbors came by to watch, some curious, others annoyed by the noise. A few seemed impressed, saying it would make the area look more organized. But a handful, like me, kept shaking their heads. You know this isn't going to end well, right? Said Mr. Reynolds, who lived 2 doors down. That creek's been here longer than any of us. You mess with it, nature finds another way. I nodded. I'd been saying the same thing since the start. One evening after the crew left, I walked along the new trail they were forming. The surface was uneven, just a thin layer of packed dirt for now. I could still see patches where the soil hadn't settled properly over the concrete beneath. And as I stood there, I heard something unsettling, a faint, muffled gurgle, like trapped water trying to find an escape route. I bent down, pressed my ear to the ground, and there it was, the creek, still flowing, but now sealed in darkness, its path narrowed and constricted. It was alive, and it was pushing back. At first, everything seemed fine. By the second week of construction, the heavy machinery was gone, and the HOA crew had laid fresh gravel along the new walking path. They planted a row of young ornamental trees along one side and installed little solar-powered path lights every few yards. In the official HOA newsletter, Derek called the project a huge success. He even included a photo of himself and 2 other board members standing on the trail, smiling like they'd just cut the ribbon on a new amusement park. Some neighbors were genuinely impressed. I overheard people at the mailbox saying things like, "It looks so much cleaner now," or, "Finally, something nice for the kids." But I couldn't shake a creeping unease. About 2 weeks after they'd sealed the creek, we had our first decent rainfall. Not a storm, just a steady, soaking shower that lasted most of the night. The next morning, as I walked my dog along the trail, I noticed something strange. There were puddles in places that had never held water before, long, shallow pools that stretched across the gravel path. They weren't huge, but they weren't draining either. Then, at the edge of the trail near my property line, I saw a small patch where the dirt had sunk down a couple of inches. It was like the ground had swallowed part of itself. The edges were damp and crumbly, and when I stepped closer, I could hear that same muffled gurgle from before, only louder. The creek was still there. It was just hidden, pressurized, and looking for a way out. Over the next few days, more oddities appeared. Mr. Reynolds, the neighbor who'd warned me about nature finding another way, called me over one morning to show me his driveway. A thin crack, no wider than a pencil, ran from the street toward his garage. It looked small, but when he stepped on it, water seeped up through the edges. "That's not normal," he said grimly. A few houses down, the Wilsons noticed their backyard shed tilting slightly, one side dipping toward the trail. Another neighbor complained that her flower bed had turned into a muddy swamp despite barely watering it. I started documenting everything. I took photos of the puddles, the sunken patches, the cracks in driveways. I even filmed a short clip where you could hear the faint rushing of water underground. When I brought it to the next HOA meeting, Derek rolled his eyes before I'd even finished my first sentence. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill," he said. "Settling happens. We're still in the early stages. The soil will compact over time." I held up my phone, showing him the video of the underground gurgling. That's not settling, Derek. That's water building pressure. You're creating underground erosion. The longer you ignore it, the worse it's going to get. He waved me off and moved to the next agenda item, upgrading the community pool furniture. That night, as I lay in bed listening to a light drizzle outside, I couldn't help but picture the creek winding under that concrete coffin, slowly eating away at the soil around it. It wasn't a matter of if something would give. It was a matter of when. It didn't take long for minor issues to turn into undeniable problems. 2 weeks after that first small rainfall, the weather turned nasty. A late summer thunderstorm rolled in, nothing record-breaking, but strong enough to dump 2 inches of rain in a single night. By the time I stepped outside the next morning, I knew something had shifted. The air smelled different, damp, earthy, and strangely metallic, like wet concrete. And there was a sound I hadn't heard before, a deep, low groan, almost like the ground itself was straining under weight. I followed it to the trail and my stomach dropped. A section of the gravel path about 20 feet long had collapsed into a shallow depression, the middle caved in like a rotting floorboard. The young trees the HOA had planted were now leaning at odd angles, their roots exposed on one side. Water pooled in the center, and even as I stood there, I saw bubbles rising from underneath, followed by the faint glug-glug-glug of trapped water fighting its way up. I didn't need to dig to know what had happened. The creek had chewed away at the soil until the surface finally gave out. But that wasn't the worst of it. As I turned to walk back, I noticed a cluster of neighbors gathered in front of the Reynolds house. Mr. Reynolds stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight, while his wife pointed toward their driveway. The hairline crack I'd seen 2 weeks ago? It was now a jagged scar nearly an inch wide, stretching the full width of the concrete. One corner of the driveway had sunk a good 3 inches lower than the rest, creating a visible tilt toward the trail. "You could roll a marble down this thing now," Mr. Reynolds muttered bitterly. The HOA board had called an emergency inspection, which turned out to mean Derek showing up with a tape measure and a clipboard. He squatted by the crack, took a few notes, and said, "We'll look into it." That same day, the Wilsons discovered their backyard shed, the one that had been leaning, now had its door jammed shut because the frame had warped. And another neighbor reported that her garage floor had started showing tiny fissures. The signs were no longer isolated or subtle. The problem was spreading. That night, I decided to take a walk in the rain to see the situation firsthand. I wore my waterproof boots and followed the trail until I reached the collapsed section. The stormwater was flowing fast, and I could see where it had carved narrow tunnels under the edges of the path. The water wasn't draining through the culvert like it was supposed to, it was bypassing it entirely, tunneling through the soil like a prisoner digging under a fence. The ground around me felt hollow. Every step had a faint give, like walking on a sponge. And in the dim light of the solar path lights, I spotted something that made my chest tighten. A thin stream of water trickling out from beneath the Reynolds driveway, heading straight toward the collapsed section of trail. The water was already choosing its own escape route. And the more it flowed, the faster it would erode everything in its path. I knew this wasn't just a neighborhood inconvenience anymore. This was the start of a chain reaction, one that could undermine the very foundations of homes. The next morning, I called the county's stormwater management office. I explained what had happened, sent the photos, and even shared my video footage from the first signs of trouble. The woman on the line sounded concerned, but she told me they had to schedule an official site visit, which could take 2 to 3 weeks. 2 to 3 weeks. By then, the damage could be catastrophic. And if the HOA didn't act before then, we'd be living on top of a sinking time bomb. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of day where nothing should go wrong. The rain had stopped 2 nights ago, the skies were clear, and the air smelled fresh. I was sipping coffee on my porch when I heard a sharp crack, followed by the sickening sound of something heavy crumbling. At first, I thought it was a tree branch snapping. But then came the yelling. I grabbed my phone and jogged toward the sound. It was coming from the Reynolds place. The scene stopped me cold. Half of their driveway was gone, not broken, not just cracked, gone. The section closest to the street had dropped a full foot lower than the rest, leaving a jagged, tilted slab hanging over a gaping hole. You could see where the soil beneath had been sucked away, leaving nothing but a hollow, muddy cavern. Water still trickled out from the bottom of the exposed edge, disappearing into the ground like a drain in a giant sink. Mrs. Reynolds was standing there in her robe, clutching her phone to her ear and pacing like a caged animal. Her husband was kneeling near the edge, peering into the hole with a flashlight. "Back up, Dave," she shouted. "That thing could cave in any second." I stayed back but hit record on my phone. The damage wasn't just dramatic, it was proof. The hidden creek had been eating away under their driveway for weeks, and now the ground had finally given up. Within an hour, neighbors started gathering. Whispers spread fast. The Wilsons muttered about moving before things got worse. Another homeowner said his back patio had a hairline crack that wasn't there last week. And then, of course, Derek showed up. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, he strutted down the street like nothing unusual had happened. When he saw the driveway, he froze for half a second before forcing a smirk. "This is unfortunate," he said. "But these things happen. Driveways settle over time." Mr. Reynolds's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "Settling? This is erosion, Derek. This is what happens when you plug up a creek like it's a bathtub drain." Derek tried to talk over him, but the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. You could feel the shift, the doubt in Derek's "everything's fine" speeches had finally cracked, just like the driveway. By noon, the local news van rolled in. Apparently, someone had called them about sinkholes forming in an HOA neighborhood. A young reporter with perfect hair started interviewing residents while the cameraman panned over the wreckage. That's when the real panic started. Because if this story went public, potential buyers would hear about it. Property values would tank. The HOA could be on the hook for massive repairs they'd caused. Suddenly, Derek wasn't brushing it off anymore. He called an emergency board meeting for that same evening. The email blast went out at 2:07 p.m., urging homeowners to attend to discuss urgent infrastructure concerns. But the damage wasn't waiting for their meeting. At 4:15 p.m., I was walking back toward my house when I heard another sharp pop. This time, it wasn't the Reynolds place. The Wilsons' shed, the one that had been leaning for weeks, finally gave up. One side of the foundation sank into the soft mud, snapping the wooden frame and sending the entire structure lurching sideways. The door burst open, spilling garden tools and storage bins into the yard. I called the county stormwater office again. "You need to come now," I said. "Not in 3 weeks. Not in 1. People's property is literally collapsing." The woman on the phone sighed. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but we have a process." "Your process is about to be buried under mud and concrete," I snapped. That night, the HOA meeting was standing room only. The energy in the room was thick, part fear, part anger, part desperate hope that someone had a plan. But as Derek began his usual opening, thanking everyone for coming, reminding us to sign the attendance sheet, I could see it in his eyes. He still didn't understand the scale of what was happening. Or maybe he did, and was just terrified to admit it. By the time the sun rose 2 days later, the neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. The Reynolds had roped off their driveway with bright yellow caution tape they bought from the hardware store. The Wilsons were moving boxes out of their shed into their garage, afraid the whole thing might slide into the yard. And every conversation on the sidewalk started with the same nervous glance toward the trail, the buried creek that had become the neighborhood's ticking time bomb. I had barely finished breakfast when the storm hit. It wasn't just rain. It was a relentless downpour, the kind that makes the gutters scream and turns streets into shallow rivers. The wind howled, rattling windows. Thunder rolled like cannon fire. For hours, I watched the rain hammer the neighborhood. I knew what was happening beneath our feet. The blocked creek, already desperate to escape, was swallowing more soil with every gallon that poured from the sky. At 3:17 p.m., it happened. The sound was impossible to mistake, a deafening, grinding roar that shook the ground like an earthquake. I ran outside just in time to see it. A massive section of the trail collapsed in on itself, swallowing 2 of the newly planted HOA trees whole. The earth around it rippled like a fabric being pulled, and the sinkhole widened by the second. The blocked creek had finally forced its way out, exploding through the side of the trail in a violent surge of muddy water. It was like watching a dam burst in miniature. The brown torrent rushed downhill, carrying chunks of gravel, splintered roots, and even one of the HOA's decorative benches. But the destruction didn't stop there. The surge of water cut across the greenbelt, slammed into the Wilsons' backyard, and chewed away at the softened soil beneath their fence. Within minutes, the fence posts tilted, then toppled entirely, vanishing into the current. And then, the Reynolds driveway went. The already damaged slab broke with a sharp crack, the rest of it sinking into the gaping, water-filled hole below. Mr. Reynolds stood in the rain, shouting over the noise, helpless to do anything but watch. People came running from their homes, phones in hand, recording as the neighborhood's neat suburban calm dissolved into chaos. Someone yelled for Derek, but he was nowhere in sight. 15 minutes later, a white county truck arrived, flashing lights cutting through the sheets of rain. 2 stormwater inspectors jumped out, surveying the scene with grim expressions. They didn't need me to explain what happened. The evidence was everywhere. One of them turned to a group of soaked homeowners and said, "This blockage should never have been approved. You've got severe undermining under multiple properties. We're calling emergency crews right now." By nightfall, backhoes and dump trucks were lined up along the street. Crews worked under floodlights, tearing up sections of the trail and digging trenches to redirect the water. The HOA board had no choice but to face the music. The county's emergency order meant the blockage was coming out immediately. But the damage to homeowners' properties? That was going to be a long, expensive fight. In the days that followed, the story made the local news every night. Interviews with angry residents, drone footage of the collapsed driveways, close-ups of the torn-up trail and gushing water. And Derek? He resigned. No statement, no apology, just a short email saying he was stepping down for personal reasons. The HOA's once pristine neighborhood now carried a scar that would take years to heal. But the creek, freed from its concrete prison, flowed again, winding quietly behind the houses as if it had never been blocked. Nature had won. And deep down, every homeowner knew the truth. It was never a question of if this would happen, only when.